A foundational teaching of the Bible is the historical account of God's judgment of the earth through a catastrophic worldwide flood that killed nearly all life approximately 4,500 years ago. The mainstream scientific community, however, considers this idea as nothing more than a fairy tale invented by the scientifically illiterate minds of ancient man. How should modern Bible believers respond to this when nearly every form of educational and entertainment media promotes the understanding that science has proven the flood to be a myth? This video explores 7 major points that should reassure every believer that there is indeed evidence for the worldwide flood. Hello, welcome to the Creation Club channel. My name is Michael, and in this video we are seeking to answer the question, if the biblical flood was a real historical event, what kind of evidence would we expect to find? There's 7 major points that we want to talk through. We're going to get right into the first one, which I think is sometimes often overlooked, and that's simply the presence of water. It is a fairly well-known fact that 71% of the Earth's surface is covered by water. But perhaps we don't often think about that as being conclusive evidence for the historical accuracy of a worldwide flood. 71% of the Earth's surface, that breaks down to 321 million cubic miles of water. That's a volume of water that's fairly hard to comprehend. To put it in perspective, let's look at it this way. The deepest point right now is at the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, and it's just over 36,000 feet deep. To give us a sense of just how deep that is, Mount Everest stands only 29,000 feet tall. That leaves a remaining 7,000 feet of water that would cover Mount Everest. It brings to mind Genesis 7. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. Now granted, this is just an illustration. It's not a fair comparison because the elevation of Mount Everest is above sea level. But again, as an illustration to help us understand just how deep the waters are, the fact alone that Mount Everest, in theory, could be covered by the current depth of water that we have on the Earth is a noteworthy and surprising fact in and of itself. Indeed, if the entire Earth's surface were leveled by the smoothing out of the topography of not only the land surface, but also the rock surface on the ocean floor, the waters of the ocean would cover the Earth's surface to a depth of 1.7 miles. We see this illustration here. This hypsographic chart shows the amount of the Earth's surface at various elevations. It essentially functions like a cross-reference of the Earth. It illustrates that if the ocean basins were pushed up 5 kilometers and the mountains shaved off, water would indeed cover the entire surface of the Earth. Now, such tectonic movements might seem huge to us at first, but when compared with the overall size of the Earth, that kind of movement is actually quite tiny, less than 0.1%. But we can note here that the graph shows the highest mountain at 8,800 meters, whereas the maximum ocean depth is just over 1,100 meters, so that is in fact greater. So if we were to level everything out, then the volume of water actually would cover the entire surface of the Earth to a depth of 2.7 kilometers or 1.7 miles. In feet, that's actually 8,858 feet. So that's still quite a depth of water. So when we think back to what Genesis 7 said about the waters covering all the high hills, we certainly could imagine that before the flood there would have been quite large topographical features. We could have high hills, just nothing to the extent of what we see today in major mountain chains, because that would have all happened after the flood, which we'll discuss later. We also must address the water cycle, and this chart here comes from the USGS website where they say Earth's water is always in movement, and the natural water cycle, also known as the hydrologic cycle, describes the continuous movement of water on, above, and below the surface of the Earth. Now, and this is an important point to understand, Given that water cannot be created or destroyed, how are we to understand the origin of such monumental volume of water on the earth? There's competing theories at work here, but this is a question that does need to be addressed. We have an enormous amount of water on the earth. So where did it all come from? Well, evolutionary supporters will suggest that it's millions of years of asteroids and comets that could potentially be responsible for the oceans. This from a NASA representative. Comets may be responsible for bringing the oceans and atmosphere to early Earth. Or another quote that says, in principle, all of Earth's water may come from comets. However, it's still possible that a large or the largest fraction came from asteroids. Either way, this theory seems to have some problems to me because 321 million cubic miles of water coming from the tiny bit of moisture and water that we find in comets and asteroids seems like filling up an Olympic-sized swimming pool with water balloons, even given the vast amounts of time that evolutionary proponents suggest for the age of the Earth. There are, however, some competing views among evolutionary supporters. Others are suggesting it's millions of years of volcanoes. This from Anthony Watts. The only plausible origin of the oceans is from the interior of the Earth. It is generally believed that most of it outgassed from the interior of the Earth during the first 700 million years of the Earth's existence. Now, what's interesting is I actually agree with this statement, at least the first part of it, about the source of the water coming from the interior of the earth. That actually agrees with what the Bible teaches concerning the formation of the oceans in part. It's the timeline there during the first 700 million years that obviously we take issue with. When we turn to the Bible, we find quite clearly the source of the oceans. They were the unique creation of God on the fourth day, in part. Genesis 1 records this. Then God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. So the formation of the seas is a clear product of God's creative works during the first week of creation, but they are also a byproduct of an extinction-level flood event that lasted 40 days and 40 nights, as recorded in Genesis 7. And on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. What's fascinating about this is this sounds exactly like what evolutionary supporters are suggesting through millions of years of volcanoes, that the water, the source of the oceans, was outgassed from the interior of the earth. And certainly this is what the Bible is describing, just on a monumental worldwide catastrophic scale happening in the span of 40 days rather than occurring over millions of years. So we see quite conclusively that the presence of water and the enormous astronomical quantities of water that we have here present on the earth become very powerful evidence for the plausibility of a worldwide flood in our recent past. Our second point is the presence of fossils. And when we stop and think about this, if there really was a worldwide flood that covered the entire earth, turning up millions of tons of sediment and debris, killing every living creature that was not aboard Noah's Ark, what would be the most obvious evidence for all of this death? Wouldn't it be billions of fossilized remains of people and animals buried in sedimentary layers of rock that were clearly deposited by large quantities of water? And wouldn't you expect to find these over the surface of the entire earth? Well, to coin a phrase from Kent Ham, that's actually what we find. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. And this lines up perfectly with Scripture. Genesis 7:21 through 22. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died. And so while we don't suggest that every fossil that exists is a byproduct of the flood, a vast majority of them certainly are. They become a testament to not only the historical accuracy of the flood as it is described in Genesis, but perhaps more importantly, their death frozen in stone becomes a testament to the righteousness of our God, who in his holiness has to judge and punish sin, and his judgment of the whole earth through the flood left behind tangible evidence as a reminder that we might look at this and be forewarned, because the Bible is clear in that one day the Father is going to judge the earth again. Lest we not fall into that punishment, we need to bring our lives into obedience with him and his holy word. Now, evolutionary supporters will often claim that we have the fossils, therefore we win. And this line of thought ignores the fact that from an evolutionary perspective, it's a very peculiar thing that there should exist such a large quantity of fossils at all. The evolutionary narrative, the evolutionary worldview, lacks the explanatory power to account for billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. In fact, the arrangement of fossils as used as evidence of evolution are based entirely on speculation, which is in turn rooted exclusively in preconceived notions. And what I mean by that is they've already decided that their idea of descent with modification over time is true. And so when they arrange these fossils in order, they're doing it based entirely on their own preconceived notions and based entirely on their own speculation about one form leading into another. That's not actually evidence. That is a biased arrangement of artifacts. It's totally conjecture. And so we have to think critically. Now, not only is the existence and presence of fossils evidence in our favor, but also the position of fossils. And what I mean by that is that there are certain kinds of fossils called polystrate fossils that become extremely powerful evidence in favor of the worldwide flood. Polystrate fossils are fossilized remains of organic material running vertically through multiple layers of geological stratum. Now, very commonly, we find these as trees, as you see pictured here, trees running vertically through many, many layers of sediment. Now, these unique fossils defy traditional evolutionary thought, since dead trees would obviously not remain intact for tens of thousands of years while sediment slowly accumulated around them. And what's fascinating is that there are a great many examples of polystrate fossils recorded throughout history and from all over the world. Here are some examples from Germany and a scientific illustration of polystrate fossils found in a coal mine in France. So we find these everywhere, and they are a thorn in the side of evolutionary thinking, because the idea of sediment accumulating slowly and gradually over great periods of time is easily and soundly refuted with these vertically oriented fossils. And even more exciting is the fact that we know exactly how these are made, because we've actually observed it happening. Here's the short version. On May 18, 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted with a force that was equivalent to 24 megatons of TNT. The ferocious explosion took out acres of trees, snapping them like toothpicks and washing them away in the ensuing mud flows and flooding. Here's other examples of just the staggering amount of trees that were broken off from the force of that blast. These trees were washed into nearby Spirit Lake, where they consolidated into large log mats that floated for decades. Many of these enormous log rafts continue to float actually to this day. In fact, we can track this on Google Earth. Take a look at this. If we zoom in to the Spirit Lake area just north of Mount St. Helens, we can actually see that these enormous log mats are present even today. If we zoom in, you can see the detail from these aerial photographs showing these enormous log mats. I mean, the quantity of this is just unimaginable. And to think that if this sort of damage was done from just one single volcanic eruption, can you imagine when the fountains of the Great Deep erupted, the number of trees that would have been destroyed by that ensuing blast. And keep in mind, this was the imagery here is dated from 2014, so this would be 34 years after the blast, and we still have this amount of debris left behind. It really gives magnitude, gives you a sense of the magnitude of that blast. So all of these trees washing into Spirit Lake, forming these enormous log mats, eventually many of these trees became waterlogged and began to float in the vertical position, and that caused them to slowly start to sink into the bottom of the lake, as we see in this chart right here. As these logs sank, they were rapidly buried by the continual deposit of sediment from the volcano and the following mud flows. Many of them were completely covered in less than a decade. So again, we've seen this happen. We've witnessed it firsthand. We know with absolute certainty it does not take millions of years for sediment to accumulate and form fossils like this. To further support the idea that fossils happen incredibly quickly, we also find fossils of animals doing things that seem to suggest they were buried very rapidly and not over a period of thousands or even millions of years. For example, we find fossils of animals caught in the middle of eating and even giving birth, like we see in this fossil here, or perhaps most astonishingly, battling to the death, as we see two fossils here. Dinosaurs engaged in the midst of a battle that were very quickly and rapidly buried in the ensuing mud flow and sediments, very likely from explosions occurring very similar to what we saw at Mount St. Helens when the fountains of the deep were broken up. So it all becomes an issue of time. How quickly do these geological features actually happen? Here from the USGS website, they say this is an image from the Lake Mead National Recreation Area, which shows a sequence of sedimentary rock layers. The oldest layers, the Cambrian, were 570 to 505 million years ago, are at the base, with the younger rocks piled up on the top. The older layers are lower relative to the younger layers. Now, they use the word younger in a relative fashion, but if we look at this chart here, they are saying that these layers here, the Pennsylvanian, the Mississippian, and the Devonian, are anywhere from 286 million years old to 406 million years old. So they're talking about, again, vast oceans of time for these features to gradually accumulate. Now, we don't have anything in this photo here to give us a sense of scale of exactly how large this particular cliff is that they've photographed. However, it does look quite similar to the image here that was actually formed after the explosion of Mount St. Helens. This 25-foot cliff of stratified pyroclastic deposits accumulated within 3 hours on the evening of June 12, 1980. That is to say, this enormous cliff did not exist on June 11th, and on June 12th, here we have it looking quite similar to the image we just looked at, with the layers of strata that have all naturally sifted and sorted themselves as they were very rapidly deposited. 3 hours this form, so it does not take millions of years. So when we put these two images side by side, again, we see the issue of time. Was it massive, catastrophic geological activities taking place, or is it a slow, gradual process that takes millions and millions of years to develop? Well, we haven't observed one happening, and we have observed the other. So I would think science requiring observable, repeatable, testable, verifiable evidence, it would seem that once again, this is in favor of supporting the Bible. So we've looked at the presence of fossils and the position of fossils. We also need to consider the location of fossils. That is to say that we find certain fossils in very unexpected places. It is beyond dispute among geologists that on every continent we find fossils of sea creatures in rock layers which are today very high above sea level. Given what we know about the current volume of water on Earth, this is incredibly powerful evidence for a worldwide flood as described in Genesis that would have covered the face of the entire Earth. For example, we find marine life fossils found high above sea level. A classic example is in the Himalayas, the world's tallest mountain range, reaching over 29,000 feet above sea level. We find fossilized ammonites are found in limestone beds in the Himalayas of Nepal. All geologists agree that the ocean waters must have buried these marine fossils in these limestone beds. The Grand Canyon is also a great source of marine sea life fossils. The rock layers exposed in Grand Canyon also contain large numbers of marine fossils. The best example is the Redwall limestone, which commonly contains fossilized brachiopods, corals, crinoids, bivalves, many different varieties of marine sea life. And you can read more about this in an article on Anches and Genesis. These marine fossils are found haphazardly preserved in the limestone bed. The crinoids, for example, are found with their columns totally separated from one another. While in life they are stacked one on top of another to make their stems. Thus these marine creatures were catastrophically destroyed and buried in this lime sediment. So the fact that we find fossils located, marine fossils from underwater creatures found in some of the highest elevations here on Earth, is extraordinarily conclusive evidence that at one point the entire Earth was in fact covered by water. Our fifth proof is bent rock layers. We look at pictures like this. The beauty of this frequently photographed region in the Colorado Plateau should not distract us from the obvious question: what caused it? Rocks don't bend, but water-saturated sediments deform when confined and subjected to great pressures and powerful movements. These amazing layers were created when freshly deposited layers of sediment from the flood were bent under the force of the great upheavals that occurred near the end of the flood as the waters abated. You'll notice there are a few people in this photo to give you a sense of scale, and you have rocks coming in horizontally from the left of the picture. They actually dip down for a bit and then run diagonally, and then by the middle of the picture and all the way to the right we have vertically oriented layers of sediment. Again, this completely defies explanation from an evolutionary standpoint. Here's a photograph where we can see this kind of activity taking on an enormous scale, where we have an entire mountain range with zigzag layers of sediment that would not only suggest upward movement, but really you only get formations like this when you're having pressures applied from both sides. So compressing pressure would cause these layers to buckle and form these remarkable zigzag layers of sediment. When we think about Psalm 104, it said, "You who laid the foundations of the earth, so that it should not be moved forever. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the voice of your thunder they hastened away. They went up over the mountains. They went down into the valleys, to the place where you formed for them. You have set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth." So the Bible clearly explains this idea that after the flood, part of the way that the Father drained the waters was the upward movement, this kind of tectonic activity that would have raised the mountains up, creating valleys and runoffs for the water to flood into, and thus filling up the ocean basins and lakes and other bodies of water. Psalm 65:6, "Who established the mountains by his strength, being clothed in power?" We see these rock layers, solid stone that has clearly been bent and contorted and deformed in ways that we simply do not see happening by modern processes. And we know truly that this confirms again our idea, our understanding of a worldwide flood, and upon all the high mountains and upon all the hills that are lifted up. So many of the mountain ranges that we see today are the result of tectonic activity happening after the flood as part of the Father's process to drain away the waters from the flood. Another important point to prove the historical accuracy of a worldwide flood is large-scale rapid erosion. When we look at the Grand Canyon, we must ask, was it a little water and a lot of time, or a lot of water and a little time? The Grand Canyon, just a few statistics here, 277 miles long. It is between 10 and 18 miles wide, and at its deepest is 8,000 feet. And we see this feeble little trickle of water that is now the Colorado River. And we're told that this is the source of all of this massive erosion. And honestly, does that really seem plausible that this tiny little river could carve these amazing geological structures out of solid rock? We just don't see those kinds of things happening today. We are, however, familiar with the erosion capabilities of a sudden downpour of rain, and perhaps you've seen scenarios like this after a great storm where water has just carved in these mini canyons into soft earth. Now imagine if the scale of this erosion scenario pictured here were increased to worldwide proportions. What kind of results would you expect to see? Because actually this aerial shot of the Grand Canyon, when placed side by side to small-scale erosion, looks eerily similar. And in fact, some of the most conclusive evidence for Grand Canyon being rapid erosion is the lack of evidence. What I mean by that is the current typography of the region just to the northeast of Grand Canyon has some interesting features that seem to fit with the idea of a worldwide flood. Strangely enough, some of the best evidence is the fact that there is currently almost no water in this area at all. However, if the low-lying areas were to be filled in with water, they would look something like this. And these were ancient lakes that have since dried up and formed the dry lake beds that are now present of the Grand Canyon. However, if we were to step back in time and fill those low-lying areas in with water, we suddenly would have these enormous lakes. Now, if this amount of water were turned loose over layers of freshly deposited sediment, what kind of erosion effects would you suspect might happen? And if all of this water did erode the 277 miles of Grand Canyon, where would all this dirt go? We can see easily imagining a natural dam that would have been formed that eventually would have broke free, sending all of this water rushing through, carving out the Grand Canyon. However, like it suggests, that sediment that's being eroded would have to have gone somewhere. Well, interestingly enough, hidden beneath the flat floor of the Gulf of California's northern basin are at least 6,000 cubic miles of sediment. That basin, bounded on the south by the largest islands in the Gulf, has an area of 15,000 square miles, with some areas having sediment depths up to 1.2 miles thick. 1.2 miles of deposited sediment. About half of the basin's sediments were rapidly transported from the Grand Canyon, which in the picture here is on the northern horizon, along the path now occupied by the river. So, to connect the dots, we have in the northeast large ancient dry lake beds. We have a canyon showing all the hallmarks of rapid erosion. And to the south, we have huge, enormous piles of sediment, clearly acting as evidence in our favor of the erosion of Grand Canyon happening as very quickly from the result of mass quantities of water. Fascinatingly enough, too, this exact process has also been observed as a result of Mount St. Helens. Before the eruption, Spirit Lake drained into the Tuttle River. The upper river, however, was buried by up to 600 feet of debris from the eruption, which blocked the lake's usual drainage site. For 2 full years, Spirit Lake was unable to drain into the Tuttle River. Then, on March 19, 1982, a small eruption around the summit of Mount St. Helens caused a mud flow that was 20 miles long. The mud flow pooled behind the debris dam and sent mud flowing furiously over the west of the Big Steam Pit. The flow quickly cut a canyon that was 140 feet deep. Now, this Tuttle River Canyon often is referred to as a miniature Grand Canyon because it's about 1/40th the scale of Grand Canyon. However, the fact that we have witnessed processes that have had a significant and dramatic effect on the topography of the land. In just 9 hours, this canyon was carved. Is incredibly supportive for the idea that Grand Canyon and its surrounding ancient lake beds and the deposits of sediment just to the south of us was in fact a product of rapid, large-scale erosion that would have happened just after or in the years following the worldwide flood. Our final piece of evidence that we're going to look at is perhaps one of the most exciting, and that is worldwide flood legends that we have around the earth. Because nearly every culture has a worldwide flood legend. And not only is this extremely compelling evidence for the biblical account of the flood, but it also correlates with the historical accounts of Babel and the creation of the world languages. The population of the world at that point in time had one language and was settled in one location. We see this documented in Genesis 11, 1 through 4. And the population of the world, having all descended from Noah's family, they all had a collective knowledge of their history regarding the worldwide flood. We see this in Genesis 10, verse 32. So when the Father confused their languages, the people took this collective history with them in their newly distinct cultural groups. And over time, these narratives formed different regional variations. That perfectly makes sense with how the Bible describes history and the significance of Babel and taking our collective history into the distinct cultural groups that we have now. So it's one common narrative. In fact, in his article, Why Does Nearly Every Culture Have a Tradition of a Global Flood? Dr. John P. Morris compared over 200 flood legends that he personally had investigated, and he found these 14 points of similarity between all of the different legends. Now, if we take those that are just in the majority standing, meaning that 50% or more of these 200 legends had these points in common, if we put that into a summary, it comes out to something like this. Once there was a worldwide flood sent by God to judge the wickedness of man, but there was one righteous family which was forewarned of the coming flood. They built a boat on which they survived the flood along with the animals. As the flood ended, their boat landed on a high mountain from which they descended and repopulated the whole earth. That is incredible. I mean, that sounds like a perfect summary of the Genesis account of the flood, and this is compiled from over 200 separate flood narratives from distinct culture groups around the world, and these are the points that those narratives have in common. Again, this defies understanding from an evolutionary worldview, which suggests that all these different culture groups were forming distinct and separate from one another. So there should be no reason that they should all have not only a flood legend, but flood legends that are so strikingly similar. In fact, another fascinating researcher, Dr. Duane Gish, in his book Dinosaurs by Design, shares how he uncovered over 270 flood legends and historic records found in many parts of the world. The various interpretations reflect the way details may change when stories are told from one generation to another without written records. So he shares several examples of some of these flood legends. Here is one from Hawaii. Long after the death of Kunihona, the first man, the world became a wicked, terrible place to live. There was one good man left. His name was Nu'u. He made a great canoe with a house on it and filled it with animals. The waters came up over all the earth and killed all the people. Only Nu'u and his family were saved. Or perhaps one in which the ancient Chinese writings refer to a violent catastrophe that happened to the earth. They report that the entire land was flooded. The water went up to the highest mountains and completely covered all the foothills. It left the country in desolate condition for years after. One ancient Chinese classic called the Hai King tells the story of Fuji, who's the Chinese considered to be the father of their civilization. This history records that Fuji, his wife, 3 sons, and 3 daughters escaped a great flood. He and his family were the only people left alive on Earth. After the great flood, they repopulated the world. And there's actually an ancient temple in China that has a wall painting that shows Fuji's boat in the raging waters. Dolphins are swimming around the boat, and a dove with an olive branch in its beak is flying towards it. I thought that was a particularly beautiful little extra detail that we're all familiar with from when Noah released the dove after the flood, and it came back with the olive branch in its beak. Fascinating that details that specific would be recorded. Found in the histories of the Toltec Indians of ancient Mexico is a story of the first world that lasted 1,716 years and was destroyed by a great flood that covered even the highest mountains. Their story tells of a few men who escaped the destruction in a Toplepetlacali, which means a closed chest. Following the Great Flood, these men began to multiply and build a very high Zucali, or great tower, to provide a safe place if the world were destroyed again. However, the languages became confused, so different language groups wandered to other parts of the world. The Toltecs claim they started as a family of 7 friends and their wives who spoke the same language. They crossed great waters, lived in caves, and wandered 104 years till they came to the Tlaxcala, or southern Mexico. The story reports that this was 520 years after the Great Flood. So this becomes, again, extraordinary evidence that we would have 270 different flood narratives from distinct culture groups that would share so much in common with the biblical narrative, especially considering the biblical narrative includes the idea that one population that shared this history, the languages were confused, and then they set out to repopulate the earth as distinct cultural groups, taking that common history with them. And we see it now recorded in these many, many different flood narratives from these various cultures. You see, at the end of the day, evolution has blinded mainstream science to see this evidence. You have monumental volumes of water on the earth. We have billions of fossilized remains of plants, animals, and humans. There's vertically oriented fossils crossing multiple layers of strata. We have marine life fossils on mountaintops. We have bent and contorted sedimentary rock layers. We have evidence of worldwide large-scale rapid erosion. And we have numerous cultures worldwide with ancient flood narratives. We gather all this together, and yet the generally accepted scientific conclusion is that the worldwide flood is considered ridiculous and unscientific. But I don't want you to be discouraged by this. In fact, I want you to be encouraged because the Bible said it would be this way. 2 Peter 3 says, knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. For this they willfully forget, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. This passage is fascinating because it tells us that in the last day there's going to be scoffers who will mock and laugh at the idea that there was a worldwide flood. And part of the reason they're going to do that is because they see that the way things are going now is the way things have always been, which is a tenet of evolutionary thinking, that the present is the key to unlock the past. And so the fact that that is exactly what we see happening should encourage us, because it just further proves that the Bible is true and its prophetic capabilities are still 100% accurate in recording the future. So we can rest assured in knowing this. We don't need to be dissuaded. We don't need to have our faith questioned. We can remain confident as we stand on the Word of God as true and righteous, and we can remain steadfast in doing our very best to remain obedient to all that it asks of us. Thanks for watching. If if you enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up button below to like it. Also, consider subscribing to the Creation Club channel so that you can be notified when new videos are uploaded. And if you know anyone that might benefit from seeing this video, we'd appreciate you sharing it with them. All of Creation Club's videos explore the idea that science does indeed confirm the Bible. You can connect with Creation Club online in a number of different ways. Our website, creationclub.weebly.com. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram, or you can email directly creationclub@yahoo.com. Thanks again for watching, and may the Father bless you and keep you.